Greetings and salutations to everybody out there in podcast land. This is the Judo Suey podcast, and I'm your host, Judo Dave Roman. I'm very happy to be back behind the microphone once again. I've had a very good week of training, in particular yesterday where I went to visit my friend Judo Joe Kaiser at Ybor City Jiu-Jitsu, where they normally have an open mat, well, not an open mat, but they have a no-gi class on Saturday. But I begged Joe, please let me bring my gi because there's something I got to work on. So he was willing to let me come to the class with the gi, and we were able to work on Yoko Tomoe Nage for about 45 minutes. Now, I don't know about you guys, but every once in a while I get this itch to learn a throw inside and out. And I wish I could do that. I wish I had the time to do that for all 67 throws of Kodokan Judo. But I have to pick and choose what throws that I want to work on that I'm most likely going to use. And for me, I've decided to work on Yoko Tomoe Nage over the next, really until I feel like I've come to a place where I'm very proficient with it. Now look, I understand I'll never be Kashiwazaki doing Yoko Tomoe Nage and all sorts of Tomoe Nage in all sorts of different directions, but I would like to have that in my repertoire so whenever I compete again, which I do want to do sometime next year, I feel the need to prepare myself, but I want to compete, and before I do that, I want that in my repertoire. So yesterday I went and met up with my friend Judo Joe, and we worked on it. We both worked on it. So what I was working on specifically was a right-on-right situation. In Japanese, they call it aiotsu. And my goal was trying to move that leg so that he is in a position for me to do Yoko Tomoe Nage. And this is something that I've been starting to practice probably over the past 3 months or so, every once in a while when I do randori, with the kids or whatever. Because I don't really have adults at my club, but when I do it with the kids, I try and do it as safely as possible. I try and attack, but my body placement has not been right. So I reached out to Judo Joe and I said, look, I need to do the uchikomi for this throw. I need to get into the position, and I need to drill just getting into position. The actual execution of the throw is not relevant to me. I just want to drill the position. So went there yesterday. We worked on it for 45 minutes or so. So, like I was just saying, I was largely doing the uchikomi. There were some other guys there, so I was explaining to them, look, I can demonstrate this throw, but I'm trying to take my ability to this throw to the next level and be able to do it in randori. So I drilled this over and over again with Joe. I did a kouchigari attack as my initial attack to open up his leg, to bring his right leg to the rear for me to spin into the Yoko Tomoe Nage. And my goal yesterday was to get into the habit of basically trying to get my left ear over to his right ankle after he stepped backwards. So I don't know if you can envision this. We're in a standard right versus right grip, like I said, aiotsu. And I do a kouchigari attack. When I do the kouchigari attack, I actually strip the grip off of my lapel. I stripped his grip off of my lapel so that I have a more free range of motion to use the hands as I do the attack. And you can do this with the strip grip before. I was practicing stripping the grip as I was attacking. So once I do kouchigari, I stop my movement a little bit and I pop that sleeve grip off, or that lapel grip off, excuse me. So once that lapel grip is off, my attack is to use my left leg as kind of a fulcrum to get myself spinning underneath him and to get my head to around where his right ankle is, move back. So it's basically the direction that my feet are pointing. I'm trying to get my head pointing in that direction as well. And that's been the toughest part for me, is getting that spin just right. And after a couple tries, I managed to get that feel just right. And something that I thought was very interesting when practicing this throw was I was just aiming to do the uchikomi. Yeah, I know it's weird to do a sacrifice throw uchikomi. It can be done. You just have to reset, stand up and reset every single time. But when I tried to do the uchikomi, and when my position and placement was spot on, he could not help but get thrown. I mean, he practically threw himself. It was so effortless to do when done right. So I had a great workout yesterday because, again, to be able to get this feel and to start to get an understanding of this throw in a basic situation and to get the feel for it. Now I know what it's got to feel like. And this is something that I can aim for in practices moving forward. This is something that I've not been able to do at my own judo club with the kids because, I'm always worried about hurting them. So I do it very slowly, very lightly, and, I don't want to hurt any kids. But being able to train with Joe, and I tell you what, guys, it's so important to, once you've acquired enough judo skill, to have a training partner that you can trust and a training partner that gets it. Because, there's guys out there that they don't get it. Like, you could do randori with somebody and it's a fight. It's going for the gold every single time. And it's not just a beginner or a white belt thing either. That happens to guys that have been doing judo for 20 years. There's just certain guys out there that you grip up and it's a fight from bell to bell. And you can't really work on anything because it's just a fight. They don't get it. They don't let up. But Joe is not that kind of guy. And some of the other people that I train with at Ybor City Jiu-Jitsu from time to time, they're not like that either. It's a great club that I like going to when I'm not at my club helping the kids. I wish we had more adults at my club, but it's just not going to be a possibility, especially with our mat situation, which is horrendous. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later when I talk about my experiences at the US Open going for my coaching certification. But I had a great workout yesterday. Long story short, I had a great workout yesterday. I'm working on Yoko Tomoe Nage, and that's something I'm going to be focusing on for the next couple of, at least 6 months to a year, minimum. So I would love to hear from you guys. What are you guys working on? And what is your approach to when you say you're working on something? What does that mean to you? Because to me, that means that I'm going to spend at least the majority of my time in a classroom setting and in randori trying to execute this throw. Regardless of whether or not I get thrown 100 times, it doesn't matter. I don't care if a white belt throws me or yellow belt throws me. So long as I'm trying to attack with this throw, that's what I'm trying. That's what working on this throw means to me. Anybody else out there working on Yoko Tomoe Nage? I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear any tips that you guys have that that may be helpful for me as I do this throw. It's hard because I'm not as flexible as I used to be, so really crouching down and really getting underneath and getting my feet there, it's not easy in my advancing age, as I'll put it gently. If you need a reminder, the email address is judochopsueishow@gmail.com. You could always reach out to me on Twitter at @LaVitaJudoka, and you can follow me on Instagram at @LaVitaJudoka as well. And for you gamers out there, if you've got a PS4, go ahead and search for La Vida Judoka on the PlayStation Network, and you'll be sure to find me. You can add me, and you can harass me on there as well, and challenge me to duels on, Madden 17 or 18 or whatever. So feel free to do that. All right, so who here has a subscription to Superstar Judo? Anybody? Have you guys seen who they are featuring this week? That's right, it's my main girl, Kayla Harrison. All right, she's not really my main girl because that would be my wife. But if you guys have taken a look at the podcast episode cover art, you will see that I have posted a picture that Kayla signed for me. And in that picture, she says all the best. And she says XOXO. My wife really loves seeing that. But anyway, she's being featured on Superstar Judo, and this week they featured her ogoshi that she's used in many contests throughout her competitive career. And it was a pretty good demonstration. Well, it was a great demonstration of ogoshi. But, the details, everything that was shown by Superstar Judo for Ogoshi, it was nothing new that I've not seen before. Everything was the basics. Everything was covered in good detail, but just nothing new. It's been typical of what I've seen in Superstar Judo with a lot of their other techniques. You have to have an observant eye in order to take a look at these techniques because they don't explain every little minute detail. But the same can't be said about my friends Nick and Cy Collier in their video about everything about arm spins. Nick and Cy Collier are the stars of the Nick and Cy show on YouTube, and they are featuring a video called Everything About Arm Spins. And for those of you who don't know what an arm spin is, that's Yoko Wakari. And I've been saying it for the past several weeks. If you have not seen Everything About Arm Spins and you don't know how to do Yoko Wakari, you need to take a look at this video on YouTube because it has been endorsed by really big names in judo and jiu-jitsu. We're talking about Dr. Roddy Ferguson. We're talking about Michael Jen from Jen Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We're talking about Dan Camarillo. And I heard even the President of the United States endorse Everything About Arm Spins. President Trump, what do you think of Nick and Cy Collier?
Tremendous people.
You see, even the President of the United States loves Everything About Arm Spins. It's a very impressive video series that comes in 5 parts. If you want to rent it, it's $2.99 for a 3-day rental or $4.99 if you want to purchase the part outright. Please visit my friends Nick and Cy Collier at www.youtube.com/Nick and Cy. That's NIKANDSI. So even, President Trump endorsing that as well. President Trump, what do you think about my podcast?
You are fake news.
All right, then. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Enough of that. So a little over a week ago, I went to the US Open down in Fort Lauderdale for a coaching seminar. Now, I have not been to Fort Lauderdale in a very long time. The last time I was there, I pretty much just drove through it to get to Key West. I gotta tell you, Fort Lauderdale is beautiful. I had no idea. Now, for you guys that are not aware of how large Florida is, I've gone over this before. You could fit many other countries in the world within Florida with room to spare. So for me, the drive was about a 3.5-hour drive. And I'm going to be going there in December because I'm going on a cruise. And there's a port there. I'm going on a nice 5-day cruise. So that'll be fun. But regardless of that, Fort Lauderdale is beautiful. And I went down to the US Open to attend a coaching seminar held by Mr. Pat Burris, who, for those who don't know, he's been to the Olympics twice in 72 and 76, and he was also one of the Team USA coaches at I believe it was the 1992 Olympics. Don't shoot me if I got that wrong. So this coaching seminar was nothing like what I expected, and I mean that in a good way. Mr. Pat Burris is a very fascinating individual to me. I really didn't know what to expect. And he talked a lot about running a judo club as a 501c3. Now, for those of you who are in the outside of the United States, I'm sorry. This is probably going to go over your heads a little bit, but maybe your own governments will have similar programs. Basically, a 501c3 in the United States is a nonprofit organization, tax exemption. Or maybe it's not a tax exemption, it's more of a tax identification. I'm not going to talk about details regarding the 501c3 because, quite frankly, I would love to have Sensei Pat Burris on this podcast. I'm going to reach out to him and find out if he has any interest in joining this hideous podcast. And maybe he can talk a lot about this in more detail that I cannot provide to you because I just learned about this myself. I've been aware of 501c3 for nonprofit organizations. I know a lot of church organizations use this designation as a nonprofit organization. So to hear Pat talk about setting up his own judo club as a 501c3 was really fascinating to me because he was talking about the different types of grant money that are out there. Not only can you take donations from individuals and those people can write those donations off as a tax write-off, But there are grants at the local, state, and federal level that are available. It's just money just sitting out there for use. Now, I'm not saying there's no work involved, but Sensei Pat was talking about these different types of grants that are available, and I had no idea. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, why in the world is my club struggling and with trying to find funding for mats when we could just go this route? Now, it's not simple. I'm told it's like a 27-page form that you got to fill out as a club owner in order to become 501c3 eligible. You have to, there's a lot of legwork involved, but you go through the legwork. And for you guys that are struggling out there with getting equipment for your club and such, you turn this into a 501c3, and it's not perfect, not a perfect solution, but there's a lot of problems that this designation can probably help with a lot of clubs that are out there that are struggling. And as Pat put it, you got to try and find a way to keep your doors open. And if that means going the nonprofit route, that's not a really bad way to go. Now, of course, there are drawbacks. You can't be a profitable company, for one. I mean, in the technical term, because I know there are organizations that are nonprofit where the administrative people take a salary from that. But of course, there's rules and such involved in that. I can't really speak to that level of detail. But I know that this is an option for club owners in the United States that are struggling financially to run their own clubs. I would love to hear from any of you guys that actually run a 501c3 judo club. I would, if you guys know more about this, please enlighten me, because I'm just trying to go through the IRS site to read about all about this, and that can be a tedious process right there. And granted, I'm really trying to research this for the benefit of my club. It's not my club though, so this ultimately lands on the shoulders of the lead sensei there, sensei. And he's the one that's got to initiate all of this, because the club's not in my name, and I don't really have an interest in starting my own club to be a 501c3, but it would be nice if we could get some funding, because quite frankly, I'm sick and tired of taking falls on 1 inch thick pads on concrete. That's too much for my body. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I take falls for kids, I take light falls, but I can't let an adult throw me on there. No way. Not unless it's just these rolling type falls or throws. So Sensei Pat talked a lot about that. He also talked a lot about coaching on the side of the mat. He also really a lot of his discussion was about running your own club and how he does things. Something he said that I thought was really interesting that I had not considered before is that when he goes to these tournaments as a coach, he does not pay his own way to go. And at his club, he has the parents pay for the right to coach their children. And that really makes a lot of sense, especially for somebody like Sensei Pat Burris, who has to travel to different tournaments and such. He's not going to pay for that out of his own pocket. And so parents, if they want their kids coaches, their kid coach, they need to contribute to his traveling fund and his food and lodging and such. And I thought that made a lot of sense. It was something that I had not considered before, and really wondered how all these coaches get around, from state to state. I'm sure some of them pay out of their own pocket, but he was adamant in saying, you should not do this. You should not pay out of your own pocket. And something else that he talked about in his seminar that I thought was really interesting to me was he talked about promotions, and he talked about the challenges of promotions, especially in Florida. And the funny thing is that he was basically saying the same exact stuff that I've said on this podcast on numerous occasions. And he was looking right at me when he was saying this stuff. So I don't think he's heard this podcast. But I wondered, it was just kind of odd that he was looking right at me when he was talking about, some of these things on how clubs should be able to promote the show. I mean, he actually said that promotions up to Shodan should not have to go through the governing body. And I agree with that. You want to go Nidan and up, that's fine. And I was shocked to hear Pat Burris actually say that. Because, well, for one, it's Pat Burris. And two, I didn't feel like as much as a loon as I have in episodes past, when I talk about promotions and such. So I know I'm not a man out on an island out there. There's a lot of people out there who agree with me, and not just the listeners, but to hear it from Pat himself, that was quite a surprise for me. Now, speaking of surprise, during his seminar, Serge Bouyssou stopped by and talked about how he runs his judo club, and it was very good to see Serge. I did not expect him to be there, at least not at the seminar, so I made sure to run right up to him after the entire thing was over with and introduce myself. It was a great thrill and a great honor to meet both Pat and Serge. And of course, he remembered me. He remembered doing the interview on my podcast. For those who are not aware, that's episode 23. Serge has one of the largest judo clubs in the country, and his club is for profit. But he pretty much echoed a lot of what Sensei Pat Burris was saying in regards to, charging money for his traveling expenses and keeping the prices high for tuition at judo clubs. So this is the part where I want to backtrack from earlier comments I've made in a very early episode on this podcast, probably around episode 14, when I was talking about Travis Stevens' comments about minimum amounts that club owners should charge their students. Now, I still do not agree with Travis Stevens saying that since club owners should close their doors if they're not charging at least $100 a month. I don't agree with that take. But I do see Pat's and Serge's and Travis's point of view when it comes to keeping the prices high for judo. And Serge was very adamant that you can make money as a judo instructor. You can have a living as a judo instructor. And I think he said he charges $150 a month for judo tuitions. Now, his club is state of the art. It's got dorm rooms. It's got classrooms. It's got a weight room. It's got a fabulous mat area. It's a really beautiful facility. It's one of the best I've ever seen in pictures. I'm sure there are others out there that rival it, like the Olympic Training Center, for example. But he was very adamant that keeping the prices high are not going to drive away people. And I've always been of the opinion that it would, mainly because I'm just a cheapo when it comes to spending money. And I might go for the cheaper place, but a lot of other people would not. A lot of people out there equate high prices with higher value. And something else that Serge said, which really drove home this point about keeping the prices high, and if he can do it, we can do it. And his point was, I thought it was very spot on, that at the end of the day, we're all teaching the same judo. Now, I'm not as good a judo coach as Serge Bouyssou or Pat Burris or Dr. Roddy Ferguson or Jimmy Pedro or so on and so on and so on. I'm not as good as them. But at the end of the day, we're all teaching Osotogari. We're all teaching Keisagatami. We're all teaching, well, we should all be teaching grip fighting. But we're all teaching different parts of judo. Some out there are teaching more kata than others. We're all teaching from the same source material. And I thought Serge had a very good point. If we're all teaching the same thing, there's no reason why we can't make a living off of this. If one person's making a living, so can you. And I guess the two biggest things I came away from this seminar is the 501c3 and the fact that you really can make a living as a judo instructor if you do things the right way. I think it's possible. I really do. I know I've had Jonah Ewell on here. He's trying to start up his own club. He's got about 50 members strong, and judging by the pictures on his Instagram, that number is growing. So I would be curious to see I'm sure someday Jonah will probably raise his prices as well as other people out there will raise his prices as well, and they won't lose their students. But, at the same token, I do think there is room for the nonprofit organization that teaches out of a church or some kind of Buddhist temple for free. I think we need places like that, but we don't all have to be that way. And I would say that's my biggest takeaway from the whole thing. Meeting Serge was a thrill, and meeting Pat was a thrill as well. I would love to get Sensei Pat on this podcast. I'm gonna email him today and gauge his interest, and I gotta pay him money because I am now gonna be a regionally certified coach, which is great. So I won't get the Kayla Harrison treatment if I want to coach one of my kids on the sidelines. Speaking of coaches, when I was down there, I did see Dr. Roddy Ferguson at a distance. I did see Travis Stevens at a distance. I wanted to go up and say hi, but they looked like they were making a beeline to see other people, and I didn't want to be one of those guys to step in there and say, like, hey, look, my name's Dave Roman. I want to meet you and that kind of stuff. Because, I'm not a big fan of when that happens to me. Like, sometimes when I'm at work and I got to use the bathroom, I'm making a beeline for the bathroom, and somebody stops me and wants to talk about some kind of project or whatever. And years ago, I would have been like, I would have stopped and talked to them, and all the while, crying inside because I have to use the bathroom, and I didn't want to be rude saying something. But nowadays I don't really care as much, so I'm just like, dude, just let me do my business. I'll talk to you in about 5 minutes. But I didn't want to go up to them, interrupt what they were doing, and get a negative experience from meeting them. So I just let it be. But it was cool to see Travis there. I've never seen him in person. He's a bigger dude than I would have guessed. He's a pretty big dude, and same with Roddy as well. He's a pretty big guy. I knew he was a strong guy. I just didn't know he was that big. So yeah, it was cool seeing them, and I didn't get to see anybody else because I had to. Actually, I take that back. I saw a couple of people that I follow on Instagram. Sensei Kamal, he's up in New Jersey. I did see him. I didn't talk to him either because he was trying to check in. I didn't talk to anybody. I just went to the seminar and then really drove home because I had to go to work the next day. I wish I could have stayed, but unfortunately I could not. The US Open fights, if anybody's interested in seeing them, they are up on YouTube. Just search for US Open Judo 2017 and you'll see all the fights on there. There's a ton of video. So they did a really good job with the video and presenting judo for anybody that's interested to see how the US Open went. But I gotta say, this was the 29th US Open. And I need to talk about something that I noticed there, which I thought was pretty bad form, to be honest. And I really hate talking negatively about people who are putting together a tournament and such. But that registration process was absurd. And I don't know if anybody who is listening to this podcast was there. How long did you wait to register? Because my students, one of my students was standing in line for 7 hours. He was in one line for about 2 hours, and he found out that he was in the wrong line when it was too late. And then he had to go to another line and stand there for another 5. Now, these people have had 29 years to get this right, and after 29 years, they can't get this right. Florida is a state of amusement parks. If there's anything that you should take away from Florida and amusement parks is long lines. But even Disney World, with all the millions of visitors that they have each and every year, can figure out how to handle a queue line. And it was a fluster cluck. Let's just put it that way. I mean, there were nobody telling anybody where to go. It was just, there was no signs that were really visible. There were no designated lines. Everybody was just crisscrossing into everybody else's path. It was just mass confusion, and I don't understand. And look, I get it. I'm sure most of the people there were volunteers, but I don't volunteer or not. You still have to do if you're going to volunteer, you got to do a good job. And whoever was head of that needs to be better prepared for next year, because that's not fair to parents. You know, not only my kids who traveled really not that far compared to so many other people. You know, you got guys, again, Serge Bouyssou brought 90 people down from Rhode Island. And it's tough enough to travel to make that distance, whether they flew or whether they drove a caravan. I have no idea, but that's a tough travel. And there were people from, I believe, from Cuba and certainly Puerto Rico and Mexico that were there. That's a lot of traveling. And to get to Fort Lauderdale and to have this kind of a registration process, this kind of, it was a disaster. I'm sorry. It was a disaster, and they need to do a better job in the future because that's not fair. It's not fair to the parents. It's not fair to the kids. And how hard would it have been to have things done in an orderly fashion and get people the answers that they need? Just have one guy stand out in the front of the door, and that allows people to ask questions when their turn in the line is up. And I guess part of the confusion was the juniors and the cadets. All of them had to register on judobase.org because this was for juniors and cadets an IJF points tournament. But I don't know. Look, there has to be better communication. It's got to be done better. I really, really hate being critical, but it's got to be said. These are the kind of things that are going to hurt judo's growth. And it needs to be fixed. So hopefully next year they'll get it right. And we'll see what they do. But other than that, it looked to be a great tournament, and seemed like everybody had a good time there ultimately. And that's the most important thing. Other than winning, of course. We are T-minus 29 days to the Judo World Championships in Budapest, Hungary. I am going to have my friend Judo Joe Kaiser join me on the podcast after the World Championships. So I will be very interested to see how the new rules play out in the ultimate stage. I know in the view of many people, it's just another tournament, but this is the World Championships. Everybody's going to be on their A game, including Fabio Basile, who has confirmed that he'll be competing. For those of you who may not remember, Fabio Basile was the breakout star at the Rio Olympics, who just came out of nowhere and won gold in the under 66 kilo division. And after nearly a year of dancing with the stars, walking down modeling runways, and seemingly doing everything else a young man can do in Italy besides actual judo, he's going to make a go for it in the World Championships. He was, again, he was outstanding in the Olympics. He just was a breakout star. He defeated An Bao. And I expect him to, if I'm going to make a prediction, I don't expect him to come anywhere near the medal stand for the World Championships. Now, you can argue Hifumi Abe has competed very little this year, and you can argue that An Bao has not competed very much at all this year, but I don't know. I would venture to guess those guys were doing actual training. I know Hifumi Abe has been going to training camps, and he did the All Japan. He was at the Paris Grand Slam, but Fabio Basile has done nothing. So I'm not very optimistic that he's going to do anything this year. If I were to make a prediction, it's not really a very bold prediction for that under 66 kilo division. I'm going to predict that Hifumi Abe is going to win that division. I think he's currently the most outstanding judoka in that division, but that's going to be my prediction. I will get to official predictions probably a week or two out from the World Championships, but as of the recording of this podcast, we're 29 days away, and Teddy Riner is a definite go for that for the over 100 kilo division. I do not think he's going to win that division. I think it's going to go to somebody else, but I'm not going to give that up just yet. I'm going to give you a full breakdown probably in about 2 weeks on who I think is going to win each and every division of both the men's and women's side. It's about that time for my favorite segment of the Judo Chop Suey podcast. What time is it? Listener reaction. So I got this message from, I got a bunch of listener reactions. Let me tell you, I think the podcast is spreading over in the UK because I happen to get a lot of followers over the past couple of weeks and some messages from folks over in the UK. I appreciate you all. I really appreciate you writing and checking in. But I got this message on my YouTube page. If you search on Judo Chop Suey on YouTube, that's where I post. I also post videos of the podcast, not of me on camera, but I do post some judo videos up there of me, but I also post the episodes on YouTube as well for anybody, doing a search for judo and they happen to see my podcast, whatever. So I get this comment on one of my older episodes that I posted, episode 9, which on that episode, that was about, how the 80s movies influenced me in my decision to pursue martial arts in my life. So this comment says, as an older guy, I simply have trouble understanding the judo is too Japanese argument. Back in the 80s when I was young, the fact that martial arts were Japanese or Chinese made them cooler. It didn't make them obnoxious. I don't think I said it was obnoxious. Anyway, continuing on. The exotic uniforms, the terminology, the bowing and other formalities, the shrines, made the martial arts seem cooler. I guess the United States has just gotten more nationalistic and xenophobic over the decades, either that, or Americans these days view martial arts as strictly through the prism of the UFC, and the origins of the individual martial arts are irrelevant to them. Now, come on, get out of here with that nonsense.
Get out of here!
That has nothing to do with that, and that's not what my case was when I was talking about judo being too Japanese for the American public. For those of you who live across the pond or somewhere else outside of the United States, don't listen to what Mr. Trump would call fake news and think that the United States has just become this racist and xenophobic hellhole. It's not anything like that. This country has never been more tolerant of people who are different than ever before. All right, maybe not in the political spectrum, but everywhere else in our day-to-day lives, we are very tolerant as a group of people. So I take exception, I take offense to this idea that this country has become more nationalistic and xenophobic. It has nothing to do with that at all. Not saying we're perfect. We have a long way to go to being perfect, but we are certainly much different today than we were 30 years ago. So I'm not going to stand for this kind of nonsense that people who don't even live in this country, I'm not going to sit here and criticize your country and your principles and the things that you stand for, and question whether or not that your country has all these different problems. I'm not going to do that. My point in judo being too Japanese is that I know for a fact, I've come across them, and I've had many people state this as in their own experiences, that there are many dojo in the United States that are a caricature of what traditional Japanese judo is. And it goes a little bit overboard with the formalities and such. That's really what I was getting at. But in terms of the exotic uniforms and exotic terminology, I mean, look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Their uniforms are far more exotic than anything we have in judo. And their terminology is just really, really wacky compared to what's common in judo. I mean, look at all the different guard names that they have. That jiu-jitsu vernacular, if there's a library on all jiu-jitsu terminology, I'd be shocked if they was all in one place. So it has nothing to do with the United States being more xenophobic or that the uniforms, the exotic uniforms and terminology is spooking people. It has nothing to do with that at all. The issues with judo in the United States go far beyond those type of things. When it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think they have a more laid-back attitude that appeals to Americans as a whole. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a market for traditional judo. But my point still stands that there are some clubs out there that portray a really negative image by having their clubs ran as a caricature of traditional Japanese dojo. And I've had other people having conversations with other people who've actually been to Japan. It's not as traditional over there as one would think. So that's where I kind of get this idea that it's almost a caricature. So come on, enough of this stuff. I don't mind. I can deal with, people poking fun at Americans for different things, but don't be ignorant about it. We're not a nationalistic country full of xenophobes. It's absurd. I also received a nice email from Kiyoshi, who is the owner of JudoFan.com, which is a judo blog. I highly suggest everybody listening to this podcast go visit JudoFan.com. And Kiyoshi wrote me a nice email offering to clean up any misconceptions about judo in Japan, since he is a blogger living in Japan. He's a Japanese man living in Japan. Go figure, huh? And he talks about things specific to Japanese judo, the AJJF, and things like that. But he was on Reddit a couple of weeks ago, and again, there are some people out there that have these ridiculous misconceptions about traditional Japanese judo. And he said, some goof off said something along the lines of that, when you visit a Japanese club, even if you're a black belt, you're supposed to wear your white belt until you've been given explicit permission, or something like that. And Kiyoshi, who's actually lives in Japan and actually trains there and runs a club over there, says that's nonsense. So, I'll take his word over the inane ramblings of anonymous internet people out there. So just want to put that out there as well. I appreciate you, Kiyoshi. Thank you for checking in and continuing to listen to the podcast. And I'd like to thank everybody else for listening to this podcast. I'm going to keep it a little bit shorter today. If you want to write to me, it's judochopsuishow@gmail.com. And as I mentioned before, you can always reach out to me on Twitter, which is @LaVitaJudoka, on Instagram, which is also @LaVitaJudoka. And you could search for me on Facebook. If you do a search for Judo Chop Suey podcast, you will find my Facebook page there. I post things from time to time. And I want to let you guys know that a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about where I'd like to set up my own website for the podcast. Well, it turns out I already have one through Podbean. So that website is judodaveroman.podbean.com. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post some of the listener reaction that I get, some of the really, really good ones, in specific the ones that I received about kata. I'm going to make more of an effort to post some of that stuff out there because I think it's valuable information for you guys to read and understand some of the history of certain kata and why we do kata and things like that. That's stemming back over the past 2 episodes where I've had some discussions on kata. So I encourage you all to check that out, and I encourage you all to share this podcast with other people who may find this of interest. So with that, I hope you have a great day. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Train hard, stay safe out there, and until next time, I'm out.
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style.